Luigi Mangione is charged with the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. When Mangione was arrested, police found some key evidence on him that they say linked him directly to the crime. But now Mangione's lawyer is saying not so fast. In a recent filing, he says this evidence should be thrown out because the police violated his constitutional rights when arresting him. So in this video, we're talking about what his lawyer wants tossed, specifically why he thinks that they should be tossed, and we'll talk about why I think this is mostly probably going to be staying in. Let's get into it. Now, before we get into some of the specific details about Mangione's motion to suppress this evidence, let's get into some of the background information to make sure that everybody's on the same page. On the cold morning of December 4th, 2024 in New York City, Brian Thompson was walking to the Hilton Hotel for a shareholders conference when he was executed at 6:45 a.m. by a masked gunman. Investigators say the shooter approached Thompson after lying in wait and then shot him point blank and fled, leaving the CEO bleeding on the pavement. Despite being rushed to the hospital, Thompson was quickly pronounced dead. Meanwhile, the killer reportedly escaped, leaving behind only a backpack containing a jacket and Monopoly money, no weapon or solid leads.
After the shooting, we're told the gunman escapes on an e-bike, rides into Central Park, then takes a cab uptown where he grabs a bus out of the city. In 45 minutes, he's gone to the wind. But images are left behind. An unguarded, flirtatious moment with a clerk, and we have mask off with a smile. Then clear eyes from a taxi cam.
We used every source of video that we could collect, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours from hundreds of sources.
Investigators turned to surveillance footage that tracked him back to the Hostel International, or HI, New York City hostel. There, they found the suspect had checked in on November 24th, a whole week before the shooting, using a fake New Jersey ID. So, who was this masked assassin, and what was his real motive? Police were determined to find out. And then, 5 days after Brian Thompson's murder, police arrested a man named Luigi Mangione at a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He was initially charged in Pennsylvania with 2 felonies, forgery and illegal firearm possession, along with 3 misdemeanors, including tampering with records and providing a false ID.
And tonight, we are learning more about the man police are calling a strong person of interest in the shooting that left the United Healthcare CEO dead. This suspect is an engineer with an Ivy League education.
Police arrested him at a fast food restaurant in Pennsylvania this morning, and within just the last several hours, he faced a judge. We have live team coverage of the latest developments. We want to start with Fox 9's Mike Manzoni. Mike, the man arrested faces several charges tonight.
Randy and Kelsey, he faces gun forgery and other charges, but prosecutors in New York have not charged him with the CEO's killing. This all started when a McDonald's worker thought he resembled the suspect in surveillance photos and called 911. That was this morning when police confronted him. They say he started shaking.
He was initially cooperative. He is not now.
5 days into the multi-state manhunt for the suspect who police say shot and killed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson on a Manhattan sidewalk, investigators have someone in handcuffs.
He has been identified as Luigi Nicholas Mangione. He's a male, 26 years old. He was born and raised in Maryland.
Police are calling Mangione a strong person of interest. They brought him into a courthouse in shackles Monday night, hours after an employee spotted him at a McDonald's in central Pennsylvania and called 911. Police found him with an untraceable homemade gun and a silencer similar to the ones used in the shooting, as well as a fake New Jersey ID that matched the one the suspect used to check into a Manhattan hostel. The arrest happened more than 270 miles away in Altoona, Pennsylvania, just after 9 o'clock Monday morning.
Mangione was then officially charged in New York with murder, 3 counts of criminal possession of a weapon, and possession of a forged instrument. He also was charged with federal offenses that can result in the death penalty, including 2 counts of stalking and 1 count of murder with a firearm and another firearms offense.
A suspect has been charged with the murder of United Health Group executive Brian Thompson. 26-year-old Luigi Mangione was arrested after a tip-off at a McDonald's restaurant in Pennsylvania. The state's governor, Josh Shapiro, says the suspect should be, quote, no hero to people frustrated with the American health insurance industry.
In a civil society, we are all less safe when ideologues engage in vigilante justice. In some dark corners, this killer is being hailed as a hero. Hear me on this. He is no hero.
For now, he is facing charges in Pennsylvania of having a host of fake IDs and having a gun illegally. But the more serious charge just came down in the last couple hours in New York, where he'll face a murder charge there and is likely to be extradited from Pennsylvania to New York at some point over the coming week or so.
So then, on December 10th, 2024, Mangione appeared in a Pennsylvania court for an extradition hearing where he was denied bail. At the same time, however, his lawyer, Thomas Dickey, has claimed that there's no solid evidence linking Mangione to the murder of Brian Thompson. And the thing is, when you go into his background, things start to get really interesting.
Private all-boys Gilman School in Baltimore, where he was class valedictorian in 2016. Mangione was also Ivy League educated, the University of Pennsylvania confirming he earned a bachelor's degree and a master's in engineering. Investigators say they're doing a complete scrub of Mangione's online posts, including Goodreads, where he quoted this take of the Unabomber: "When all other forms of communication fail, violence is necessary to survive," Mangione calling it interesting. And a post elsewhere of an x-ray of a back. Two senior law enforcement officials tell NBC News investigators are looking into whether it belongs to Mangione and whether it has anything to do with the crime. His last known address was in Honolulu. A friend from Hawaii told CNN Mangione struggled with back pain.
He confirmed that he had surgery, and he sent me the x-rays. It looked heinous.
Another friend telling The Times, Mangione's family said that they had not heard from him.
Well, we are learning a lot more as the hours go by about this chief suspect, Luigi Mangione, 26-year-old, as you mentioned, grew up attending an elite private school in Baltimore, attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he seems to have studied engineering and computer science. He even helped teach a course on artificial intelligence to a group of high school students in a summer program at Stanford University. As investigators pour through some of his social media accounts, they're learning a bit more, including that he at one point seemed to praise the writings of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who he said was rightly jailed, but had made some interesting points about where society was headed. On his Goodreads account, there were a lot of references to books about dealing with lower back pain and back health medical issues. It seems that's created some speculation about whether there may have been a medical issue in his own background that resulted in some bad or difficult exchanges with.
The back pain issue has been highlighted by many as a possible turning point in Mangione's life. He apparently started experiencing debilitating back pain and brain fog. And after he had surgery to alleviate the pain in 2023, he reportedly fell off the grid from friends and family. And many think that his experience with surgery may have radicalized him against the healthcare industry. So now, on February 21st, 2025, Mangione's attorney filed a motion to suppress a bunch of this evidence, as well as the statements he made. Now, it's not surprising why Mangione would want any statements he may have made around his arrest and other pieces of evidence that were found during his arrest to be kept out at trial. But as far as the actual legal arguments are concerned, they basically point to two things. First, he says that the police did not Mirandize him early enough in the encounter, and when they did Mirandize him and he refused to talk, they continued to interrogate him as they were not supposed to. And second, they say that the Altoona police officers, when they eventually arrested him, initially made an unlawful Terry stop and also an unlawful search and seizure of his backpack. But before we go further into their specific arguments as to why they say these things happened and why they were unlawful, let's first talk about what these things are and what kind of rights are implicated by them. Let's start with Miranda Warnings. Most likely you've heard of Miranda Warnings or rights under Miranda v. Arizona. This comes from the 1966 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Miranda v. Arizona. It's something that comes up when a person is arrested by the police, and if the police do what they're supposed to do, they basically tell them four things. The specific wording can vary from one jurisdiction to another, but basically they say some version of the following. You have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used in a court of law against you. You have a right to consult with an attorney before and during questioning. And if you cannot afford an attorney, one can be appointed for you. Now, not every encounter that people have with the police will trigger a Miranda warning, and this is really important for people to understand. Specifically, two things need to happen. First, the defendant or the suspect is in police custody. And second, the law enforcement officers have to be initiating some kind of questioning or otherwise engage in some kind of conduct that's understood to be meant to draw out information from the suspect. Now, when we're talking about custody, it's not just when someone is officially arrested and shackled and in the back of a police car, for example. A person can be in police custody even just for a relatively brief moment if there's enough in the current circumstances that shows that a reasonable person would understand that they are not free to leave and go and do whatever they really want to do. So this, for example, could happen when the police come to your house to execute a search warrant. Let's say they don't handcuff you, but they ask you to sit at your kitchen table while they go and search your garage. You're in police custody until they leave or until they otherwise tell you that you're free to get up from the kitchen table and to do whatever you want without them watching over you. The same thing can be true if you are in the hospital and you're not handcuffed necessarily, but there's a police officer that's staying in the room or just outside the door of your room. Now, keep in mind that the other part of this to trigger Miranda is an interrogation. This means it has to be that the officers are either asking questions or otherwise doing something that is, like I said before, understood to extract information from you. So for example, if you have a suspect who is sitting in the back of a police car, let's say they're handcuffed, they're obviously in custody, and no one read them the Miranda rights, but they just start volunteering a bunch of information and no one has asked them any questions whatsoever, that's not an interrogation. It doesn't matter if they were Mirandized or not. The suspect is giving away information on his or her own. And this is generally why it's a good idea to just zip it in any of these circumstances, according to most lawyers out there. So then what happens when the police fail to inform a suspect of their Miranda rights?
The department was forced to drop the charges because you forgot to read him his Miranda rights. What possible reason is there for not doing the only thing you have to do when arresting someone?
I did read him his right. I did a version of that.
Contrary to popular belief, like in movies like 21 Jump Street, which is a hilarious movie otherwise, failing to properly Mirandize doesn't necessarily mean that you have to just drop all of the charges against the suspect. It's actually much more limited than that. Specifically, it means that you can't use any of the statements that the suspect made during the custodial interrogation where they weren't Mirandized. So for example, if somebody makes a complete confession to the crime during a situation like that, you can't use that as an admission. So let me make that really, really clear. Miranda is only about whether or not to allow in potentially incriminating statements by the suspect at his or her trial. And you can have a bunch of custodial interrogations that the police conducted of a particular suspect. And maybe in all but one of these interrogations, the police properly Mirandized the suspect. In that one encounter where they didn't properly Mirandize them, they can't use his statements or her statements against them in court. But from all of those other interrogations, they are free to use those statements. And this does not stop the police from being able to admit any physical evidence at trial. Okay, so that's Miranda in a nutshell. What's a Terry stop? The phrase Terry stop comes from the 1968 U.S. Supreme Court case Terry v. Ohio. This refers to an investigative stop by the police. In Terry v. Ohio, the U.S. Supreme Court said that a police officer can stop and frisk a person that they reasonably suspect to be armed and involved in a crime. More specifically, the officer does not need probable cause to arrest the person in order for them to properly conduct a Terry stop, so long as they have a reasonable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. However, they do need to have more than a mere hunch that this person has maybe done something wrong. So then what can the police do during a Terry stop? They can ask the suspect for their identification, and they can do a basic pat down of the outside of their clothing to see if this person may be armed and dangerous. And now here's something that's important to understand about police encounters in general. They are entirely fluid and depend highly on the facts of what happens at each step of this encounter. So if they take the step of running the suspect's ID through the system and they pat down the outside of their clothing and they find something that actually raises their suspicion about this person, then they might be able to investigate further. This means looking further into the clothing or the items around them, like a backpack, for example, that might have other items as well. And the same is potentially true of the opposite. If, for example, the police conduct a Terry stop on someone and they take their ID and they run it through the system, they find nothing in the system about this person, that might decrease the officer's reasonable suspicion. And at the same time, if they do a basic pat down of the outside of the suspect's clothing and they don't feel anything at all in their pockets, that might also decrease the officer's reasonable suspicion. Now, there can also be, of course, situations where police officers go into the encounter with enough background information on this person that they have a strong suspicion that they have committed a crime. In that case, an argument can still be made that they are reasonable in their suspicion of this person, even if, say, for example, the pat down doesn't really reveal much. So then let's go back and look at the defendant's motion to suppress to see how they say all of this went down. As we know, there was a massive manhunt that followed the murder of Brian Thompson. And the New York Police Department shared photos of the person that they suspected to be the shooter with the news and across social media as police actively tried to find him. And on December 9th, 2024, a McDonald's employee called Altoona police after Mangione was recognized from some of these images. Now, when police arrived, Mangione says that the first of the two arresting officers immediately posted himself to the right of the defendant and within an approximate arm's length of the defendant. And they say this action was taken in order to detain and or totally curtail the liberty of the defendant and to restrict the defendant's path of travel or ingress/egress from the table where he was sitting. And they basically go on to say that it was abundantly clear to Mangione that he couldn't get up and leave because the police were blocking his way and basically forming a human wall between him and the exit. Mangione also says that at no time did the two officers indicate that defendant was free to go, nor did they explain the reasons as to why defendant was being detained, other than that he looked suspicious and or overstayed his welcome as a customer at McDonald's. And then Mangione says that upon approaching him, Officer Detweiler commanded him to give his ID, stand up, and put his hands on his head. So for purposes of a Miranda analysis, it looks pretty clear to me that he is in police custody, assuming all of this is correct, of course. It would be very interesting to also see the body cam footage that undoubtedly exists from this encounter to see if it lines up with the way that he's explaining it here. But anyway, so it sounds like he probably was in custody at this point. So did they interrogate him? Because remember, you can't have a custodial interrogation without an interrogation. According to Mangione, they did indeed ask him questions. And after 15 minutes of this encounter, the police finally told him that he was officially under a police investigation, but says they still didn't Mirandize him. But then 2 minutes after that, one of the officers did read Mangione his Miranda rights. Then they asked if he wanted to talk to them, and he shook his head no. So at least on the face of this motion, it looks like we do in fact have a custodial interrogation, and in my opinion, reading this, the need for a Miranda warning is triggered. Again, assuming all of this is true. And there's another thing that I want to point out here. When he was asked after being Mirandized if he wanted to talk to them, he simply shook his head. This is arguably a clear and unambiguous response to the police telling them no. And that's very important because if a suspect is read his or her Miranda rights by the police, and then the police ask the suspect if he or she wants to continue talking to them, and the suspect kind of waffles on whether or not they want to, maybe they shake their head no, but they kind of say, I don't know, maybe, the police in that kind of a situation can continue talking to the suspect. They can continue asking them questions. However, if on the other hand, the suspect simply says, nope, and they leave it at that, the police are supposed to withdraw from any kind of questioning. Or alternatively, if the suspect says something like, I'm not talking to you without a lawyer representing me in the room with me, then that has the same effect. That's why it is very important for a suspect to be absolutely blunt in a situation like this. And nonverbal communication that is also clear, like shaking your head no, for example, also satisfies that requirement. And in this situation, after Mangione shook his head no, he says the police continued to interrogate him. So that's potentially a problem for the police. Now, I say potentially because the motion to suppress actually doesn't say whether Mangione made any specific statements at all during this whole encounter, or if there were any specific statements that they want to have kept out. And maybe they're keeping it general because they just want all of the statements kept out and they know that he said things, but they just want everything out. That is entirely possible. But if he actually didn't say anything during this encounter and after they Mirandized him and continued to interrogate him, he didn't say anything then there's nothing to be kept out. So assuming, of course, that this is in fact the way that it all went down, this does appear to be a situation where any statements that Mangione would have made during this encounter probably should not be admitted when this case eventually goes to trial. Now, what about the Terry stop? If the court decides that the Terry stop was unlawful, then all of the evidence that they found on Mangione when continuing to investigate him further after that initial pat down, the initial scan of his ID, all of that evidence that was found on him might be kept out of trial. And that's important because the police actually found some really strong evidence linking him to the crime inside his backpack. But now about that Terry stop, Mangione's attorney argues that he was unlawfully detained, but they don't really give all that much in the argument. At most, they basically say that the police basically lied to him about why they were stopping him. And so they say that this is an unlawful Terry stop. But, this really is not a proper analysis for whether or not this was a proper Terry stop. It really has nothing to do with what was communicated by the police to the suspect. It has everything to do, on the other hand, with the information that the police officer or the officers had at the time of the encounter that either made their suspicion about the suspect reasonable or unreasonable. And here you have the manhunt for the shooter that took over the airwaves in the days after the shooting, plus the photos that the NYPD shared of the suspected shooter. I mean, here's an ABC News report from December 9th, 2024, the day that Mangione was arrested, on the manhunt showing everything that was known to the public.
Today, new video obtained by ABC News shows the suspect wanted for the murder of Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson lying in wait. When the killer spots his mark, he runs across the street and opens fire. In newly released photos, the suspect is seen getting into a New York City taxi about 20 minutes after the shooting, appearing to look right at the camera.
We feel comfortable. We're getting closer and closer.
Hundreds of tips are pouring in, thousands of police officers working the case.
I don't want to do anything that's going to tip them off. Him off that we're on his trail, but we feel really good where we are.
Again, NYPD divers searching a Central Park pond. They hope to find the gun used in the shooting and the bicycle.
So the public had a lot of information about what this person might have looked like. And the police were called here after a member of the public identified him as the man whose photo they saw either on TV or on social media. And all of this was happening really relatively not that far from New York City, which is where the murder occurred. On top of that, I wouldn't be surprised if the police said that they ran his ID through the system and it picked up that he was some kind of a suspect, or that there was some sort of a match to the suspect that they had based on all of the information that they knew about him from the hostel he had stayed at New York, all of the surveillance footage that New York City was able to collect of him, etc. Basically, what I'm getting at is that there probably was enough information that the officers had to have, at the very least, a reasonable suspicion that this is the same guy that killed Brian Thompson, which means this was probably a proper Terry stop. And if that's the case, and the police patted him down and found enough through that, or through his ID scan, or just from the information that they had about him prior to this to either increase or maintain the level of suspicion about him, then the search of his backpack was probably also reasonable. And in that case, this would mean that all that juicy evidence found inside the backpack would also be usable at trial, subject, of course, to all of the other rules of evidence. So basically, most of this, in my opinion, is probably likely to come in. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Are you one of the many people out there that is supporting Mangione, either because he's like this Robin Hood figure or because he's physically attractive to a lot of people? Or are you horrified by the actions that he allegedly has taken here? And do you think that all of this evidence should be kept out? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you would hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to know how to best support the channel, consider becoming a member of Byte Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you in the next video.